What does Joan Brown Campbell mean to Andrew Young?
Well, one of my best friends.
Yeah.
And a person whose career has paralleled mine. And we sort of grew up in the National Council of Churches together. And I ended up serving as president at the 50th anniversary of the council when she was the general secretary. Mm-hmm. And she's just my sister. We hit it off on almost every issue. And we spent 3 weeks in China together, countless board meetings. The board meetings were the most difficult. Of course, all board meetings are difficult. But she's a wonderful woman.
Your current work, especially with the African nations and sense of justice, led to the creation of the movie called Rwanda Rising.
Yeah.
One of the things we do at the Jackson Center, we are involved in the tribunals that are occurring in Rwanda. And Hassan Jallo, who's chief prosecutor, comes here frequently. Is there a connect there between you looking at the Rwanda genocide, the Rwanda Rising of what's happened since then, and sort of that justice and reconciliation?
Well, I think that Rwanda, for me, is the most significant act of reconciliation in my lifetime. And they are really working at it. And it bothers me that that people always judge them for their failures and don't realize the tremendous success. They've moved way beyond South Africa, for instance. And ironically, it's harder to forgive people who are like yourself. I mean, it's easier for black people to forgive white people than it is for them to forgive each other. And I don't know why that is, but this is one case where the Tutsi and the Hutu don't even want to recognize their past. They want to obliterate that and just say they're Rwandans. Now, my secretary, who introduced me to the Rwandan situation, lost 92 members of her family. And yet she had no bitterness and is now serving as the Rwandan ambassador to Kenya. But the president said, look, there's nobody to blame but ourselves. And we either saw this coming or we should have seen it coming and did nothing. Some participate in it reluctantly, but there's nobody that is not guilty. And so there's nobody to condemn anybody else. The only path for us is to forgive each other, and only then can we forgive ourselves for what we didn't do.
All of that deals with the sort of reconciliation, negotiation. What you learned in Birmingham in negotiating sort of the end of that process, you were in the middle of all that with the businessmen. Does that play out today as well? It's
very, very much the same.
Yeah.
And I followed many of the same tactics, which I learned from Quaker negotiating meetings, where one of the things you do, you learn that you can make more progress through listening to your opponent's arguments than through trying to state your own. And so in Birmingham, I never argued with the businessmen. I always was the blame. We were the ones that came there and stirred up all this trouble. And it was ridiculous, but it didn't make sense for me to argue that. The problem was that the trouble was stirred up, and my job was to find a way to settle it. And to settle it in a way that gave them a face-saving way out. And by focusing on my opponent's needs I found that all my problems were solved. And we found the same thing true in Panama with Picard and the Panama Canal, with my efforts with Southern Africa, with Zimbabwe and Namibia. I never argued with the South Africans. I said, look, this is a problem. Either we deal with it without violence and take some nonviolent risks, or we do nothing and you have a bloodbath somewhere down the road. I think it's better for us to see if we can work out some resolution of this conflict. But it's up to you to want to do that.
Were you surprised that you were able to get resolution in Birmingham?
No, I wasn't.
Really?
I mean, I knew the South. I was born in New Orleans, as I said, at an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on the other, and the Nazi Party was on the third corner. And so I had to hear people hailing Hitler before I went to kindergarten. And my parents explained to me that white supremacy was a sickness. And you don't get angry with sick people, you try to help them. Now, some people will say that that was naive with the Nazis, but it was naive once Hitler became Hitler. It was not naive when Germany was dealing with hyperinflation. We could have headed that off 20 years before it happened. We couldn't do it once the invasion started. Thank you very much.
Traveling through Sierra Leone and talked to all of the people. And they certainly felt a sense of closure after the trial was completed. And in that sense,
there was a sense of closure in Ethiopia when they got rid of Mengistu. But they just let him, or in Uganda when they took Idi Amin to Saudi Arabia. And he died he just died. Everybody forgot about him. See? And the thing about the trial is it revives all of this.
that's true, particularly when the trials take place, often years after the crime.
Yeah, and I just don't feel, I haven't felt comfortable with, and yet if it had not been for the movie Judgment at Nuremberg, I don't think people would have seen the significance of Selma. Okay, so.
It's a pleasure.
We're at the Jackson Center. Robert Jackson was involved in the Nuremberg trials and Brown versus Board of Education, so it's a perfect connection. And I happened to read that you were good friends with the Russian ambassador, Oleg
Trinovsky.
who was at the agreements when they actually decided to have the Nuremberg trial.
Well, he was a very interesting fellow because he was the son of the first Russian ambassador to the United States. And he went to Sidwell Friends School in Washington and went to Swarthmore College. My daughter Andrea, who's here with me now, was a student at Swarthmore. And just as I became ambassador, I was taking her to school. And the president, Dr. Friend, said, you must get to know my friend, Oleg Trinovsky. Said he was my doubles partner on the tennis team, and we were roommates for a year. And he's the Russian ambassador. So once we got to know each other, his wife and my wife both loved to play tennis. He met his wife at a tennis court. And my wife was an avid tennis player. So we played what we call diplomatic doubles all the time. His wife and I were partners, and my wife and he were partners. And we always split sets. Yeah. But it meant that we had a personal relationship. And I don't know that that's, but whenever there was a conflict, I could go to him. We never talked politics on the tennis court. But whenever I needed to talk politics to him, I could go to him. And I don't think it's an accident that because of our personal relationship, I never had a Russian veto the whole 3 years I was at the UN.
to pick up today some baseball cards.
Ah,
And I wondered if I could just this is sort of a name recognition, and if there's
Sure.
a vignette or something that as you look at these names, that would be terrific.
yeah, Thurgood Marshall, whom I met when I was in 6th grade. And he was a young, skinny attorney pleading the case for the equalization of teacher salaries in Louisiana. Of course, Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy. Roy Wilkins, head of the NAACP, and one of those organizations that worked with us on everything. Jim Farmer, head of CORE, who really started the Freedom Rides. Ralph Abernathy, without whom we might not have had a Martin Luther King.
Right.
Ralph was a senior pastor to Martin. He gave in to Martin's leadership and agreed to be supportive of Martin's leadership in Montgomery. Otherwise, we would have had some of the traditional preacher fights and wrangles over leadership. Phillip Randolph is the father of the civil rights movement in many ways, was the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and went with Mary McLeod Bethune to see Franklin Roosevelt about desegregating factories during the war. Oh, yeah, I knew him as an older man. This is E.D. Nixon, who, with Ralph Abernathy, decided that Martin Luther King would be the better leader. And Whitney Young, who headed the Urban League and was professor of social work at Atlanta University, whom I knew most of my life. We used to call each other cousins. John Lewis, of course, who was a student when I was at the National Council of Churches. And when we saw John Lewis on television in Nashville, my wife and I decided we had to leave New York and the National Council of Churches and come back to the South. Yeah. But it was the inspiration of John Lewis. This is James Meredith and John Doar going into the University of Mississippi. Brown versus the Board of Education. That's a little before my time. I was not active, but that might be Bill Coleman, who later became Secretary of Transportation.
Did your paths cross with his?
All the time, later on,
Yeah.
but I didn't know him back then. Of course, Rosa Parks, who in many ways was the mother of the movement.
What kind of lady was she?
She was the quietest, sweetest, and most humble person you ever want to meet.
Right.
And she was more like Mother Teresa than, say, Winnie Mandela.
Right.
And of course, Julian Bond, who was one of our youngest heroes, and who has remained, in fact, we just endowed a chair at University of Virginia in his honor. Of course, that looks like the March on Washington, which I attended, and Septima Clark was the woman who developed the citizenship education program that I came back south to work with. I really came to work with Septima, but our offices, we were sharing offices in the SCLC building, and Martin started asking me to help him with his mail, and pretty soon, it took about 4 years, but I transitioned from the citizenship education program to SCLC. And this looks like Daisy Bates, who was one of the parent who led the fight for the Little Rock Nine. And Fanny Lou Hamer, whom I helped to recruit into the movement from Ruleville, Mississippi, and whom I went to get out of jail in 1963 when she had been jailed in Winona, Mississippi, and beaten for 3 or 4 days simply because she wouldn't say sir.
Right.
Fred Shuttlesworth is the father of the Birmingham movement. And I've never known a more courageously crazy man. He just did not believe in any kind of, to think about it and be rational about it was against his nature. If it's wrong, confront it, take it on, no matter what the price. Ruby Hurley was the secretary for the NAACP in the Southeast for the early 60s and late 50s. Of course, Medgar Evers, who was assassinated in Mississippi in 1963, but who was the field secretary for the NAACP throughout Mississippi. Actually, I went to work with Martin in 1961 in Septima Clark's program, but I was really an employee of the United Church of Christ. And I was sort of the administrator for the citizenship program, which Septima ran, but I ended up being pulled into training young people for the civil rights movement and assisting Martin in his mail and some of his correspondence.
But you happened to be in Memphis in '68 when he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. You were there principally, though, you were testifying at a hearing, weren't you?
Well, I was there testifying in behalf of we had been prevented from marching, and we went to federal court. And I had spent the day in federal court when Dr. King was prevented from marching, and we actually won the case. But as I came home and had been in court all day, we didn't have any cell phones in those days, so he hadn't heard from me all day long. And he started picking up pillows and throwing them at me, saying, "Where have you been? I haven't heard from you all day long. You have to keep me informed." And he started throwing pillows, and I started throwing them back. And it was, I mean, I'd never seen him quite so happy and frivolous. And 15 minutes later, he was gone.
The reason were you guys going to a reception? Was that the reason?
We were going to Billy Kyle's home for dinner.
When you heard the shot, did you think it was a shot, or?
No, I actually thought it was a car backfiring.
Really?
And I had no idea it was a shot. And then I looked up on the balcony and I saw that he was not on the balcony. And I actually thought he was clowning and had, sort of gone back into the room. And then I saw his shoes sticking out under the balcony.
Did you get a sense, as far as, did they have an identification pretty immediately where the shots came from? And
we were pointing across the street to where the shots came from. Now, the shots could have come from, there were many people that said they saw shots coming from some azalea bushes that were about 6, 8 feet tall. And the FBI decided that it came from the window, the bathroom window. It really didn't make much difference to us then, but interestingly enough, when we came back from the hospital, the Memphis Parks Department was cutting down all those bushes and swept that whole area clean. So they were at least complicit to the extent that they destroyed the crime scene.
Right.